Welcome to the Mentoring Novice Teachers Session 1 Makeup video. In this video, we will be doing a very brief course overview, a grounding, and then we will focus on two areas of mentoring: building trust and the learning-focused verbal tools. Take a moment to read the outcomes for tonight's session. Now take a moment to read our statement of purpose for the Mentoring Novice Teachers course. As our grounding, think about your own first year as a teacher. You may have had an amazing first year with an amazing mentor. You may have had a tough first year with very little mentor support. You may have had an amazing first year and very little mentor support. Mentors can play a key role in the success of a first-year teacher, and this course is designed to support you in providing your new teacher or teachers with what they need to have a successful year and to grow in their practice. What we're going to be talking about in this session, but throughout this course, is not only grounded in our statement of purpose, but also with the goal of maintaining emotional safety for our new teachers. Just as the role of teaching and mentoring has changed over the past decade and a half, so too has our understanding of neuroscience and how children and adults learn. The different tools, skills, and concepts that we will be exploring aren't just about the warm fuzzies. They are about setting the tone so that complex learning can happen, because we need to feel safe in order to access that higher level learning. Current research in neurobiology stresses the primary nature of emotional processing and its direct links to higher cognitive processes. There are more neural fibers running from the brain's emotional centers up into our logical rational areas, or the upstairs brain, than there are running down to the downstairs brain, which is our housekeeping area that controls breathing and the fight or flight response. Threat or perceived threat inhibits thinking. Our brains are wired to detect the subtleties of muscle tension and posture and gesture and vocal stresses that signal danger in any form. And incoming sensory data moves through the limbic portions of the brain, that downstairs, to evaluate first if we're in danger. And if the incoming information passes this test, another circuit fires and sends the message to the prefrontal lobes of the cortex, or that upstairs brain, for processing. If the downstairs brain detects any threat, it might inhibit or abort this shift to the upstairs brain. A classic example of this is watching a student panic and freeze when asked a question in class. The answer might be in his brain, but it's not biochemically accessible in that instance. All this to say, we must provide emotional safety to produce cognitive complexity. Consider how vulnerable it is being a new teacher. The fight, flight, freeze reaction is on overload, and even with the best of intentions, we can accidentally trigger negative responses in them. What we are learning in this session will help you become aware of those subtleties that could shut down learning or foster a space of emotional safety and cognitive complexity. We're going to start with the foundation, which is building trust. There are many parallels between your teaching practice and mentoring. Just like in our classrooms, building a trusting relationship needs to happen before learning can take place. Trust is the basis for creating that emotionally safe space. And there are 3 ways that we can start the foundation for building trust, and we'll be exploring all 3 in this session. Note that these are just the starting steps. If they're not present, it will make it hard to establish a trusting relationship. But there are other further actions which will be explored throughout this course that also need to happen in order to deepen and maintain trust. So what are those 3 building blocks for building trust? 1 is being present. 2 is being in alignment. And 3 is being a listener. I'd like you to take a moment and pause this video to complete the following in your session guide. Read the 3 quotes in session guide task number 1 and consider what 3 words or phrases stick out most to you. You have a space to do some writing about that question in the study guide. Once you've finished, please unpause the video and continue. Let's talk a little bit about being present. Human beings are highly attuned to the nonverbal signals of others, and this capacity for attunement has a biological basis. Attunement is that feeling that another person understands our experience and the reciprocal sense that this other person also feels understood. And while our capacity to attend fully is a really innate part of our being human, there are times when the potential for distraction or lack of attention is high. So for example, when we're fatigued or stressed, our minds might wander away from the present moment and away from our colleague. When we have a lot to do, when there's little time available, the same conditions apply. And given the pressures of life in schools, conscious attention to being with our novice teachers is a challenge that is particularly important for us to overcome, because being fully present is a powerful way to offer support. So it can be challenging to be present, and it's important that when you can be mentally available, that you make yourself mentally available. And if you can't be mentally available in a moment, that you advocate for yourself and you say, I really am not available right now, and I want to give you my full attention. Is there another time that we can meet? When you aren't fully present, it might not trigger a drastic fight or flight reaction, but it does shut down communication. And over time, these repeated distractions will break down trust. Let's talk a little bit about being in alignment. Our brains are wired to feel more at ease when we feel like we fit in more than when we don't. This is why it is easy to feel self-conscious, for example, if you go to a party and you feel like you're not appropriately attired, like you're wearing jeans and everyone else are wearing dresses and suits. It also extends to when our nonverbals don't match what our verbals are saying, or match what others are saying or doing around us. Mismatch causes dissonance, which makes us uncomfortable, and reducing that dissonance puts us more at ease. So if you're talking to a student at their desk, for example, especially when you want to connect with them, you will probably crouch down to be on their level. And you do this unconsciously, but the reason you're doing it is that by eliminating the height gap, you are physically showing that you are on the same level as them. So you want to be mindful of this when you're working with your mentee to convey that you are on the same level. We do this with alignment, and you can find notes about being in alignment in session guide task number 2. So alignment has 3 distinct categories. That is physical, which includes muscle tension, posture, and gesture; vocal, which includes intonation; and pace and word choice and breathing, which includes depth, duration, and rate. So for example, if you're a naturally animated person, like you use your hands a lot, when you encounter really calm, maybe still people, the gap can be very obvious and drastic, and you might feel uncomfortable. And so you might bring your energy levels down or try not to move the hands as much when you're talking to someone like that. So you can intentionally create alignment by purposefully matching your colleague's use of nonverbal and verbal elements. So here are a couple of tips and tricks for being in alignment. Consider the overall vibe they're giving off. Do they seem animated, lower key, relaxed, more formal or informal? And try to match the vibe. You don't have to match them exactly. Like if they're moving their hands very wildly, you don't have to do the same thing, but you also don't want to sit completely still and be like opposite in terms of nonverbals. So maybe you move your hands a little bit more than you might normally. If there's a big difference between your vibes, try to narrow that gap, right? So if they're sitting with very rigid posture and are clenched up, and you're more like, I'm going to curl up in my chair and be relaxed, try to meet them in the middle. Maybe like sit with both feet on the floor and your hands still, but with like relaxed shoulders. Use alignment deliberately if or when you anticipate there might be tension or anxiety in the conversation, or tension or anxiety emerges as you're talking. When you have difficulty understanding what they're saying, or when you are distracted, because it does help put your focus more on them. The final part of attending fully is about being a listener. First, You show you are listening by being present and being in alignment. And then, this is the hardest part, by actually listening. Physically aligning with another indicates our positive intention and enhances our ability to understand. Listening with total attention and with the intention to understand and not judge another is a foundational skill for mentors. In this way, we establish a safe environment for thinking together. Maintaining this quality of listening presents both a mental and emotional challenge. The human brain processes listening and speaking at significantly different rates, which creates a space for attention to wander. Also, there is a difference between understanding and agreement. Understanding means that we get another person's perspective and ideas, but don't necessarily agree with them. Listening to understand requires that we control that chatter in our heads that might be asking questions or saying no, or I don't agree, or whatever it might be. This is a discipline that can be learned, however. We can train our brains to be better listeners. This is a moment where I'd like you to pause to complete the following tasks. As part of your pre-night one work, you completed an effective listening survey. Take a moment to pull that up and check out your scores. Keep in mind, the lower the score, the more skillful you are as a listener in a particular category. Next, read about unproductive patterns of listening in session guide task number 3. Once you have finished, continue this video. So we just talked about how we can retrain our brains to become better listeners, but how? There are 4 types of listening that you just read about that stimulate the habit cycle, which is why so many of us are guilty of doing it. Each listening habit fires its own routine and reward. For example, some people relate through story. When they hear an anecdote or example told by a colleague, it triggers a memory search for a personal tale or experience to share. This reward is a feeling of connection to the other person and a sense of contribution to the conversation. In many social settings, this is an appropriate response. During mentoring conversations or learning-focused conversations, this listening habit may impede focus and consume time. There's a notion that one contributes to a conversation by speaking or interjecting. Like, I'm paying attention to you because I'm interrupting with a connection. And this expectation leads to conversations in which we're either talking or wanting to talk or waiting to talk, but not maybe actually listening to our colleagues. Not interrupting does not equate to listening. Often, silent individuals may have either checked out or are composing their next remark, but to listen deeply with full attention requires energy and a commitment to the learning-focused relationship. Listening carefully to others also involves monitoring our own internal processes and developing awareness and control over these common internal distractions. These blocks to understanding shift our focus inward to our own opinions and interests and judgments. And this shift to self, or I listening, stimulates non-productive habits and distracts us from understanding others. Listening through the lenses of our own worldview diminishes our capacity to understand the perceptions and concerns of others. And because it is important for mentors to understand how their beginning teachers are thinking about their practice, it becomes even more important to practice deep listening skills. So with all unproductive habits, it's one thing to identify it, it's another to break the habit. And there's a lot of research behind why habits are so hard to break, because they're neurological patterns that are reinforced by repetition, and the way we listen is a habit. Now, I want to make a note here that's important to keep in mind. The listening patterns and purposes of social conversations are different from the listening patterns and purposes of mentoring conversations. And the reason I'm making that distinction is because, 1, I don't want you to walk away thinking that you shouldn't be connecting with others using personal anecdotes, or that you always have to be in deep listening mode. And 2, because some of your conversations with your mentee are going to be more social, checking in about weekend plans, seeing how a PD or a meeting went, etc. What we're focusing on here are those learning-focused conversations that you have with your mentee to purposely build capacity in them. Okay, so back to the habit cycle. The habit cycle includes a cue, an embedded routine, and some form of reward. So what happens is a stimulus in the environment, the cue, triggers a physical, mental, or emotional response, a routine, which results in some sense of satisfaction, the reward. Now, with repetition, this cycle becomes a habit. So, for example, if for years you've been an interrupter because you come from a family of interrupters, and the only way that you can get a word in edgewise is to interrupt, it's going to take conscientious effort and time to rewrite that habit in your brain. And it's these habits that we don't question in ourselves that are often the reason for tension and lack of productivity in a learning-focused conversation. For example, telling without asking, fixing not teaching, or solving a problem instead of facilitating problem solving. Awareness of our personal listening patterns is the first step in developing the capacity to attend fully. If we're conscious or aware about full attention and our own listening, this can prompt new routines, and as a result, we develop new habits in our ways of attending and responding to our colleagues. So, in this sense, a stimulus in the environment, the cue, flags your consciousness about embedded routines, that awareness. And you create a new physical, mental, or emotional response that replaces the old routine. It's your pattern break, which results in the sense of satisfaction in building capacity in others, your new reward. And you start to break the habit cycle this way. And throughout this course, I invite you to pay attention to these unproductive habits and challenge yourself to break them. And take a moment to read this quote. We're going to move into the Learning Focused Verbal Toolkit now. It's pretty clear that attending fully is critical to establishing and maintaining trust. But as we explored in the virtual content, the mentoring relationship is not just about emotional support. To fulfill all support functions, we need to create a space for learning. And that happens using the Learning Focused Toolkit. This adds verbal elements to the physical foundation we spent the first half of class focusing on. The pause, paraphrase, invitational language, and inquiry are essential resources for guiding structured conversations, which we'll be delving to more with the online content. Language and thinking are interactive processes, and each energizes the other, and each limits the other. Learning-focused conversations, those more formalized conversations you have with your mentee, create, nourish, and sustain language development around all aspects of teaching. The ultimate goal of such conversations is to support language and thinking production capacities in our beginning teachers. In this process, we often extend our own thinking and language production capacities. Thoughtful, thought-filled conversations require carefully constructed containers to support them. And we craft these containers from several important verbal elements drawn from a learning-focused toolkit. And the first part of this learning-focused toolkit is purposeful pausing. The pace of a conversation affects both the emotional and intellectual climate. Frequent, well-placed pauses contribute to a beginning teacher's confidence and capacity. For most people, consciously pausing to provide a space for thinking requires practice and patience. Silence can feel uncomfortable. If you've ever stood in front of a class of students and asked a question and had to wait in silence, you know what that means. We often perceive the lack of immediate response as a struggle and rescue our beginning teacher with advice and suggestions. The fast pace of our world tends to support the belief that there's a relationship between speed and intelligence, but what we need to remember is that complex thinking takes and requires time. Our use of a pause in learning-focused conversation emerges from our cultural and personal experiences. The history is the source of comfort or discomfort with silence in conversations. For example, I used to be very uncomfortable with silence in a conversation, even just a social conversation. And I won't say that I am now completely comfortable with it, but I've had to become very conscious of how I try to fill the silence with nothingness because I just can't stand to sit there in silence. While it might seem counterintuitive in our culture, slowing down actually improves the efficiency of our interactions because it reduces threat and increases clarity. Pausing is a foundational skill in a learning-focused conversation because it supports focus on the other person and reinforces the intention to encourage thoughtfulness. Now, often our responses are unconscious, but being aware of pausing and creating new habits is an important goal for mentors. So consider this. The mentor asks a question and the beginning teacher is silent. That's our cue. This quiet creates discomfort for the mentor who provides an answer to the question, the routine, and this response pattern alleviates the discomfort of silence and fills the void with information. There's the reward. And this is a habit that we want to break. In a learning-focused conversation, there are 4 influential opportunities for pausing: after inquiring, after the teacher responds, before a paraphrase, and after a paraphrase. And you'll learn a little bit more about what this might look like in your pre-Night 2 module. So before you continue, I'd just like you to consider, what is your level of awareness when it comes to purposeful pausing? We're going to move into invitational language now, because the words we use and how we say them can instantly trigger the downstairs brain and slam the door to the upstairs brain if we aren't mindful of the unspoken meaning. So we're looking for that sweet spot between what you say and how you say it in the most invitational way possible. So there are a couple of different components to invitational language. There's the syntactical layer, which are the words you use, and we're trying to keep it non-judgy. So you want your questions and your paraphrases and your words in a learning-focused conversation to be open-ended, so there's no right answer. You want to use broad language, so like plurals, tentative language, like might, and then positive assumptions. So when you did blank, how might you have X? So think about think about the tonal layer. So I'm not here to be your boss, but to help. So you use an approachable tone. So take a look at these 2 questions, and what do you notice? The question on the left, have you looked at the planning and pacing guide when you plan? Versus the question on the right, what might be some ways the planning and pacing guide help you form your learning target? So notice how the question on the left is a yes or no question. It's not open-ended. And then it doesn't have a positive assumption. Have you looked at the planning and pacing guide when you plan? So it's essentially implying that they haven't looked at it. The question on the right is open-ended. What might be some ways this helped you form your learning target? So there's not one right answer. Notice the tentative language, might be some, and the plural, ways. So there's more than one way. And then there is that positive assumption. How did this help you form your learning target? So that I assume that you did use this planning and pacing guide to form your learning target. So I'd like you to pause here and complete the following. There is a virtual question sort in session guide task number 4. So open up the document and look at each question and determine whether it is a good example of an invitational language question, a bad example, or something you're not really sure about. And once you finish this task, please return to the video. Now that you've had the opportunity to do your invitational language sort, I'd like you to consider, what did you notice? And what might be some wonderings you have about invitational language? And if you'd like to jot a couple of questions in your session guide, please pause the video and feel free to do that. So working on these skills does take time. So we're going to be baby stepping throughout our time together. Prior to our next synchronous session, you'll complete an introduction to the other 2 components of the toolbox, inquiry and paraphrasing, so that when we meet together, we can work not only on the skills from tonight, but apply them as we practice together. For your reflection, please go to session guide task number 5 and review the norms and answer the 2 reflecting questions. Please make sure that you do complete the pre-night 2 module prior to our next session 2. Once you have completed the reflection, please send it to your instructor in order to receive attendance credit for session 1. Thank you.